Hello, hello, beautiful friends. It is David Ault, and I want to welcome you to The Gathering. This video is the end of a series of stories that I've been sharing with you for the month of September around all things Kaleidoscope Child Foundation. I believe that there's great power in storytelling. I know that in your life you've been affected by stories just as I have. And my reason for wanting to create this series was to see if someone out there might want to come and be involved with us. Maybe you want to physically be involved with us, or maybe you want to find a way to support our efforts in global education. Um, this final story is what we would call the origin story. And it's very funny because I think, oh, everybody's heard this before, but we live in a massive world with so many people. And of course, people don't know this story. And it's kind of a little bit like being in a band and you've had a number one hit, and then decades later, you're still singing that hit, and you're thinking, no one wants to hear this anymore. It kind of feels like that. I feel like, oh my God, everybody's already heard this, but this is the way we're going to wrap it up with a couple of new insights that I'm going to add for today. I have to start with the fact that there is tremendous importance in understanding your values. Even when you don't know what a value system is, it is the engine, the fuel that sort of leads you in the direction and the choices that you're going to make. As a child, growing up in an impoverished environment, an environment that was highly abusive, both verbally and physically and sexually. I was the last of five children, and none of my siblings and I were very much in alliance. There was separation there, and everybody was doing their own version of survival. My version, as the baby of the family, was to hide in trees and not only hide in trees, but take books with me. And I would lose myself from that toxic environment into the stories of so many change agents in our history, people that persevered. And it gave me tremendous hope because I could read the story of a challenged person and I could also continue to read how they persevered. I used to call it stick-to-itiveness, how they just kept going. And it gave me some sense of direction. And I would climb this tree in a front yard in Beaumont, Texas. And I kind of fancied myself a little Marco Polo, the great explorer. And every year on my birthday, I would take a thumbtack and I would stick it into the tree. And the thumbtacks would stack upon one another as if they were creating an arrow. And I don't know what I was thinking, but I thought at least at some point that arrow would be a reminder for me that the only way to go was up. And of course, over time, in such rainy, humid environment, the thumbtacks would get all rusted. But there was something about those thumbtacks, that ritual, the safety harbor of that tree, that there was a value that was being birthed. And I call it adventure. Again, I was a kid. I didn't know what a value system was, but reading books birthed within me a value for adventure, which means a value is something that is directive. Oftentimes, when I work with groups or individuals, we will work on a value system. Like, what's the top five values that motivate your life? And so adventure was there. It didn't have to be forced upon me. It didn't have to be worked upon. It just was birthed from the toxicity of that environment. And so, oddly enough, ironically enough, paradoxically enough, that was a cool thing. That was something that really changed my life to come from that in order to motivate me to see the world. I didn't know how I would see the world as a kid growing up in poverty, but fast forward to my adulthood, to having followed a path in the arts, a path in spirituality, becoming a singer, developing a little bit of a following, and using that following and the email list in order to create opportunities to work with travel companies to invite people to go around the world. Fellow musicians had told me about that possibility, that if you have a big email list and you advertise a trip, you get so many people, your trip is free. I couldn't even begin to fathom that as a possibility, and yet there it was. It was true. First time I did it, I was so nervous putting out my little notice, my little newsletter to go to China, to go to the Great Wall of China. 45 people signed up. I could not believe it. I could not believe that this vehicle for adventure existed. And that's kind of how it began. Many other stories in between all of that, but that's how little old me, David from Beaumont, Texas, growing up in that environment, wound up climbing the Great Wall of China without spending a dime, money that I would never have had to do that kind of stuff. And I saw that I had an adaptability and sort of an innate sense to be able to create containers of safety for people. I would call it like having group consciousness. I could see when people were tired. I could see when people didn't want to be involved. And I knew that I had to be on in these environments, and that was okay with me because I was reaping a harvest that I didn't even know was possible. And so, again, fast forward many years into that as a supplemental way for me to earn a living, to explore my creativity, to define who I am as a person, to understand what I'm capable of, and to be exposed to cultures and places that I had only read in those books up in the tree. And now the origin story. It's 2004, 20 years ago. One of those trips was to Thailand and Cambodia. And we first ventured off to Thailand. About 16 people, 15 or 16 people signed up for that trip. That was all that I needed in order for the trip to happen, for my way to be paid for. And I remember Thailand was beautiful. It had many wonderful things to see. And the group was a lovely group. And then interspersed in Thailand or sandwiched in it was going to be a 3.5 day excursion to Cambodia. What that meant was we were going to leave the bulk of our luggage in Thailand at the hotel we were at. We were encouraged then to pack a little small bag where we would do one of those little small planes to Cambodia, and we would see the famous temple called Angkor Wat. If you're not familiar with Angkor Wat, it's one of the great ancient wonders of the world. It's the thing that literally saved Cambodia, that level of tourism. And that's what we were going to see. And we all had our little bags and we were all on the little small plane. And the moment that we landed, you could say that everything began to change. You ever been in a situation where you land and there's a familiarity there, or there's just something that grabs at your attention? And I remember the heat and the humidity walking off the plane because you had to walk outside to get into the little small facility. 20 years ago, there was just this concrete block where they processed people with their passports. I'm not kidding you. It was a concrete block. And the officials who checked the visas sat up on a pedestal, and we were down in a floor like a mosh pit, like you're at a concert, and you had to throw your passport up to them. Obviously, 20 years later, things are dramatically different. But this is just an indication of how vulnerable the country still was, how unrepaired it was from their civil war 30 years ago. And so we're all kind of standing there and we've thrown our passports up and they've caught it and they're calling out our names and they're stamping it and then they're just throwing it back out. And that was quite something. And we went to a hotel and I remember that in those early hours that people were shocked by some of the juxtaposition of what was going on in their peripheral view in their vision, because what they were seeing was hardship. What they were seeing was immense poverty that wasn't covered up, again, juxtaposed with the luxury of being a tourist, like a really nice hotel. And I always called it the delineation between the haves and the have-nots. Here were people, many of them seeing this up front and close for the first time. So that gestation of uncomfortableness and, oh my God, is starting to percolate in all of the individuals, and I'm trying to pay attention to it. And we do start on the adventures of seeing the temples. However, the more that we got into the outlying area of Siem Reap, and the more there was exposure to the locals, the more that the people began to feel this like sadness and natural empathy about wanting to do something. Now, there are many, many schools of thought that talk about how inappropriate it is for tourists to come in and kind of do these things that are one-offs. And I'm so glad back then that I was completely ignorant of that. I'm so glad back then that the rigors of what's appropriate were not so cemented in my mind that it clouded the natural instinct, the natural empathic response to want to help, as crude as it might be. And so it was overwhelming. They were like, we have to do something. Let's help in some way. So I went to the guide and I said, everybody wants to help. I understand that we're only here for just a few days, and that whatever we do is not sustainable, but maybe there's something that you know of that you could help facilitate us to be of support for. And he kind of looked at me a little strangely. And the more that we talked, I said, what's the worst? What's the worst of the worst? And that prompted a conversation about the Tonle Sap Lake, which is the largest waterway in that part of Asia. He told me that in the dry season, the lake bed recedes very far. And in between when that starts and the next monsoon season, that there is this congregation of displaced people, be it landmine victims, be it refugees from other borders, from Vietnam or Laos, just the poorest of the poor. And he said, in this conclave of people on the bank of the Tonle Sap is pretty much the worst or the most dire condition. And there's a ton of children. If you want to do something, feed the children. And we were like, feed them what? And that began another discussion about you can't just show up, you can't just bring anything. You've got to find things that are indigenous to their digestive system. So I'm just giving you a little picture of the details and how these details started to domino with regards to how are we going to do this. And it all was kind of going very quickly in the discussions until he said, just let's go get things from the local vendors. So local markets or local vendors are growers who bring their produce, just like our farmers market, but it's basically the mainstay for the local people to get their food. And we went, and as we began to look at the stalls and to see what was available, we wound up as a collective, everybody was in agreement to buy what was the equivalent of 3 local markets worth of food, 3 vendor stalls of food. It was a lot. It was so much that it had to be put in boxes and bags, and we needed extra vans in order to be able to store it all, and as well for us to be able to take it. That was another logistical thing that was taking place in real time. And when I went to pay for the accumulative food that we had bought, the total was $86. And I say that that was the defining moment. $86. I have this memory of staring at my feet and my shoes, whatever I was wearing, they were all kind of dirty and dusty from walking and mixing around in the grass and dirt of the market area. And I was having this sort of realization or time lapse of me as a kid, maybe with my little shoes on, dirty shoes, and being there and $86 and comprehending the fact that even some kid from Beaumont, Texas, who had nothing could do something. Like $86 was completely manageable. We were all going to split that. That meant that just a few dollars and we were going to be able to feed some hungry kids. And I was so overcome by that and the new window of awareness and possibility that we very methodically began to pack all of this. And the guide said this: you got to give me a chance to get a message to the matriarch of the village, that transient village. So even a transient village, one that's just makeshift, it too has a leader or a matriarch, a wisdom keeper that sort of holds the container for that. I don't know how he did it. This was in the time before cell phones were so rampant that everyone has one. But when we arrived in that caravan of vans with the food to the banks of the Tonle Sap Lake, we weaved our way through a bunch of garbage and mud, and there, sitting in these uniformed rows, were these children. And everything was orderly for about 7 minutes because somehow the awareness of us passing out food to the kids wafted through the ethers. I don't know, but all of the sudden there was a stampede of more children running, grabbing to try to get some of the food that we were passing out. And as quickly as it seemed to have started, it was over. Like a quick storm that just kind of came in and then it subsided. And when it subsided, the group was huddled together, breathing heavily, like, wow, what just happened? And a woman looked down at her skirt. She had a white skirt on, and it was covered with little tiny mud handprints. And she said something like, oh my God, look at this. This is the canvas of humanity. And she started to cry. And that crying was very contagious, almost like yawning. Like someone starts to yawn, everybody started to get very open and vulnerable and teary and crying. And I'm the leader. Remember, I've built this sort of reputation as the one holding the container. And I knew that something unparalleled, something I had never experienced before, was going on inside of me. And that I was not going to be able to control it. When I look back, I believe it was the first bridge from my beginning healing of what occurred to me as a child and my ability to try to mitigate those types of horrors for another child. That's first level perception, meaning I saw that I didn't see, I was feeling the drive within me to try to prevent others from experiencing what I had. And that's not a special feeling. We all have that. We all want to help uh, relieve others from the past lessons and experiences that we've had. I believe at the core of our heart, we do. And I could just feel that this experience was something carved in time that was meant to be. And I just started to wail, almost as if the pent upness of the terror and the sadness and the grief finally had permission, finally had an outlet. Actually, I wouldn't even say it had permission because it was not going to ask me if it could come out. It was coming out. And again, it was unprecedented, and I'm looking for a way to get away from people. And all that there was a pontoon boat that was tied. And I remember crawling on my hands and knees into this smelly pontoon boat, face down, just wailing, wailing, not even having the wherewithal to be self-conscious because there was no controlling of this. And it seemed to go on for a great while. And when it subsided, I recalled something that I was working on at the time, a little spiritual practice. It was a mantra. And oddly enough, that mantra had appeared in an airline magazine. And when I read it, I was like, oh, it was by a writer named Doug Boyd. And he said, the most powerful mantra that you can ever say is, I'm available. And then it was followed by, look out, because if you're sincere, your whole world will change. I had been so captivated by that in my little airline seat at some point in my life that I thought, I'm going to try this. And I was kind of dabbling with the idea of I'm available towards things that were unknown or seemingly difficult. But in that pontoon boat, wailing like that, feeling just everything in my cells, it was almost like my heart burst open. I just kept saying, I'm available. I'm available. I'm available. Now, granted, remember, I'm going on these adventures because I wanted to see the world. I wanted to be able to broaden my sense of awareness and to feed something within that little child of mine that felt so left out and neglected. I did not have the skill to be able to manage anything long term. I was just there as a sightseer. But I left as a part of that community. I left somehow my my it sounds so cheesy to say my heart. I left a part of my being in Cambodia with those kids, with that vow. I'm available, even though there was no skill. And so again, 5 years, I'm available, going back. And in the proximity of those 5 years, thinking that all kinds of things were going to happen and open up and it would be easy. It wasn't easy. I didn't know what I was doing. There was no one who was interested in my little ideas. And in the middle of those 5 years, I met a Cambodian man and he taught me about the importance of water and how many of the villagers drink in mud holes and that we could help relieve that situation with a generator and an auger and some PVC piping and to be able to create these rudimentary water well systems, which was much better than the locals drinking out of mud holes. And it was very affordable. And so I would gather a little money. I'd go back to Cambodia. We would dig a couple of wells. In the process of that, I'm seeing all of these children unschooled. They don't have uniforms on. They're dirty. There doesn't seem to be any direction or um, formality for helping them. I ask about that. I'm told and I learned the crash course between a government school, which is kind of like glorified daycare. It's not really offering any kind of skill or up-leveling or ability for them to get an education that's going to change the trajectory of their life. So how do you do a school? How do you do a supplemental school? I'm going fast through all of this, but those 5 years were so tumultuous. And I remember there were many times when I thought, what have I gotten myself into? So beware when you say I'm available and you mean it, because there will be huge amounts of doubt, self-doubt, um, wanting to give up, remembering those books in the tree as a kid, the stick-to-itiveness and going, you can't give up, you made this vow. 5 years later, issues with the government, being put in a holding cell for a while as they did background checks on me, scary things, frightening things, silly things, things that made me feel so inept and frustrated, and yet I just kept going. And at the end of the 5 years, getting approval to start an NGO. An NGO means a non-government organization. All that that really means is that you are able to create something, and there won't be government interference, but you have to report on all kinds of things. And obviously, there's a lot of detail in that. So the little NGO to start a school. And this man who had taught me the wells, his name was Ohm, had taken some of the little seed money and he had rented a little space out in a field off of the grid. And when I landed back there in 2009, 5 years later, after all of these other years of going, we drove out. He presented me the piece of paper and he says, "You have your school." There was like 200 kids there. And I remember being petrified once again, like, oh my God, what have I gotten myself into? I don't know anything about running a school in Cambodia, but we did. We learned. We eventually, like by the next year, had to move that little temporary place into Siem Reap proper. And in the course of 1 year, we were able to get enough money to build, it's like an outdoor pavilion. It had a roof and it had the little sides, and we had enough for desks, and but it was open air so the air could go through, and there were plenty of kids, more kids than you can even imagine. And the process of creating systems and organization and administration and how to do this began to happen. It wasn't in place to begin with. It developed as we developed, as we said, we have a school. Many people have come and gone, but today, 2024, 20 years from that moment on the bank of the Tonle Sap Lake, we have two campuses in Cambodia that teach English predominantly, life skills, computer technology, sewing. It has a big emphasis on the arts, both in music and traditional Cambodian dance, and all of the things that are necessary in order to uplevel a generation of children so that their opportunities in the world are fruitful, more so than if they didn't have that, if they had continued in the same generational path as those before them. And thousands of children have come and gone in the course of starting that officially with the pavilion in 2010 till today. And in 2016, standing on the rooftop of one of the buildings, looking out, reflecting upon the systems that were in place, and beginning to entertain the idea that perhaps we might be able to replicate this one other place. I traveled to India and pretty much had the same experience of traveling around, except this time I was a little more skilled and I knew that everything centered around the person, meaning the person on the ground, the person who would be your administrator, your eyes, your feet, your hands, in order to bring something like an educational system to life. I found that person in Bodh Gaya, India, and gave them the opportunity to, with seed money, to start programs there. Today, we have two schools in India. We also work with an existing school in Guatemala, focusing on predominantly the education of Guatemalan girls and helping them find their way out of slave labor. We've got an ongoing grant right now that we're happy about to assist a school in Kenya, Africa, and we are doing work in similar vulnerable school programs and territories within the United States. All of that, all of that coming from I'm available. All of that coming from a value system. So I want to just leave that with you as a possible exercise and exploration for yourself. First of all, thank you for following the stories for Kaleidoscope. Thank you for many of you for giving and donating. Without you, we couldn't have kept our doors open. Without you, we would not have been able to grow and develop in the way that we have. Without you, we wouldn't really realize how powerful a US dollar is in these territories, how far it goes. That's why every dollar counts. That's why whatever you can give makes a huge impact. To invite you to come with us. It's one thing to tell you about it and to show you pictures, but it's another to have you come and experience it live and in person. To follow us at Kaleidoscope Child Foundation to find out when those trips are scheduled, and to begin to work on your own value system. I know that you've probably heard about value systems before, but there's great power when you really, really embody them. To have embodied a sense of adventure from adversity makes you realize that everything has been exactly the way that it needed to be, that this was sort of an inevitability for me, and that I won't call it my unhealed trauma as a child, but my unrevealed trauma as a child played a huge part. And I want to leave you with this little switch. I call it flipping the script. In my continued journey of healing, I was made aware in a ceremony once that that experience on the Tonle Sap Lake, where we thought that we were feeding those children, what I was shown was that they were actually feeding us. That we, the Westerners, the ones who seemingly came from privilege, were the ones that were starving, and that they were the providers, they were the teachers, they were those that were providing such beauty and such healing for us. Boy, did that really change. And I've practiced now playing with the idea of flipping the script often. I do it a lot of times when I'm overseas in our territories, and I catch my Western mind thinking that I'm the one doing when I realize that perhaps I'm the one receiving. It's very humbling, it's very healing, it's very mind expansive in the way in which we interface with the world. And with that, I hope that you can flip the script of what's possible for you, that you will look at your values and sit with them and decide, what is it that I want to say I'm available to? And together we can watch how our whole world changes for the good. Blessings.